Hello, everybody. Dear participants, dear experts. First, I would like to thank you for participating in this present webinar because I know all of you are very busy. You have busy schedules, but you find time to register and to connect your device to listen or to ask questions to our eminent speakers and experts. Therefore, I really appreciate your virtual presence for 1.5 hours that we'll be spending together. My name is Taro Boyle. I'm the moderator of this webinar. I'm an economist working for the commodity branch at the United Nations Trade and Development, formerly known as UNCTAD. Please allow me to give a brief background about this event. This is a series of webinars organized to disseminate the Commodity and Development Report 2023 that was launched in October last year. The so-called UCDR is a major publication of UN Trade and Development. This current issue discusses many issues, including economic diversification, inequality, climate change, and green energy policies. So I don't want to waste your time. So I'll ask our eminent officials to open the webinar. So I'll give the floor to Mio, please. Mio, you have the floor. Mio is our director. She's the acting director of the Division of International Trade and Commodity at the United Nations Trade and Development. Please, Mio, you have the floor.
Thank you, Taro. Dear colleagues, distinguished experts, and valued participants, I just want to have a small opening speech here, if you don't mind. Welcome to the joint webinar on inclusive economic diversification and energy transition. Please allow me to start by thanking Mr. Hongpeng Liu, who is the Director of Energy Division at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, or UNESCAP, and his dedicated team for excellent collaboration that we have had. Today, we discuss the key insights of UNCTAD's Commodities and Development Report 2023. I do not wish to steal too much time away from your in-depth discussion, so let me please highlight 3 key points from the report. The first point is that any economic diversification strategies should be combined with policy to enhance economic inclusiveness. The report shows that export diversification has been historically associated with rising income inequality, thus underscoring the need for governments to implement inclusive social policies while promoting diversification. The second point is the need to design export diversification strategies in the picture of climate emergency. The report shows that economic diversification has so far depended on the extensive use of fossil fuels. Due to the climate emergency, we can no longer pursue the same path. This suggests that commodity-dependent developing countries must explore new energy sources to diversify their economic structure. Green industrialization may lead to new jobs, boost incomes, and reduce inequalities, but it presents a formidable challenge. The third point, which may be particularly relevant to the ESCAP members, is how to finance the green industrialization. ESCAP is a region where some of the world's largest carbon emitters are located. And given this unique economic and environmental challenge, the region may need to design strategies to achieve inclusive economic diversification and a low-carbon transition at the same time. Other related issues include the way countries in the region may need to leverage their significant potential in renewable energy sources, such as solar, wind, and hydropower, to drive both economic diversification and energy transition. Dear colleagues, distinguished experts and valued participants, I hope this webinar provides a valuable platform for you to enrich discussions on trade, commodities, and sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mio, for the opening remark. I now pass the floor to Mr. Ongpeng Liu, who is the Director of the Energy Division at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Mr. Liu, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Taro. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants. First, I would like to congratulate UNCTAD team for officially launch this inclusive diversification and energy transition report. So this is very useful and helpful. I also want to thank Ms. Shirotori and Clovis for inviting ESCAP to join you and to organize this regional webinar. I'm honored to speak on behalf of ESCAP with you all as we delve into critical discussions surrounding our energy future and the achievement of a shared target under the Sustainable Development Goals and also relevant international agreement, especially the Paris Agreement. So as the world continues the implementation of energy transition, it's imperative to take stock of the current landscape. The Asia-Pacific energy supply remains heavily reliant on fossil fuels. So while recent years have witnessed commendable growth in renewable energy, the Asia-Pacific region's share of renewable energy remains low compared to other regions, and the deployment remains concentrated in a handful of countries. So if the world is to triple installed renewable energy generation capacity by 2030, more countries across our region must be fully engaged in deploying significant new capacity. For many countries, perceived investment risks, limited technical capacity, and lack of supportive policy frameworks pose significant barriers, hindering their ability to keep pace with those leading the renewable energy push. So the report, the commodity-dependent, report indicated that the commodity-dependent developing countries face particular challenges on this front. So these nations also face significant vulnerabilities due to their reliance on commodity exports, exacerbated by global market fluctuations, economic shocks, and the imperative of transitioning to a low-carbon future. So the energy transition offers opportunities to build resilience through diversification and leapfrogging into cleaner, more efficient technologies and approaches. To effectively diversify energy systems and navigate the energy transition, governments are tasked with creating enabling policy environment that attract much needed investment and enable the development of clean energy sectors. Diversification entails not only expanding revenue streams, but also moving up value chains, fostering innovation, and ensuring inclusive to bridge within country disparities. In addition, cooperation through multilateral and regional initiatives can strengthen supply chains, harmonize regulations, and build a larger market for clean energy. So energy efficiency should be seen as a cornerstone in this endeavor, offering the most cost-effective and readily available solutions to help meet rising energy demand and achieve climate action target. So this could begin with improving energy efficiency standards and introducing green industrial policies for buildings, materials, equipment, and appliances. Standards along with the electrification of sectors and end use such as transportation can help ensure that essential services supporting livelihood, economies, education, health, and overall well-being are accessible, affordable, and sustainable. At the same time, energy efficiency policies can catalyze new market development that support low-carbon economies. Scaling up renewable energy application is a critical path for energy transition and achieving low-carbon development. There's a great potential in developing economies in Asian Pacific region to accelerate energy transition in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, including contribute to the target of tripling renewable energy capacity globally and doubling the global average annual rate of energy efficiency improvement by 2030. As indicated in the Commodity and Development Report, that the commodity-dependent developing countries should leverage untapped potential in renewable energy sources to explore new energy markets, both domestically and internationally, and green products that can help create new jobs, boost incomes, and reduce inequalities. However, the journey towards an inclusive energy transition must first address access to modern energy services. Despite the improved progress, so 53 million populations in Asian Pacific still lack of basic electricity connections, highlighting the urgent need to ensure reliable, affordable, and equitable energy services. So progress is not just about connecting households. It's also about ensuring that these connections can support the services and activities that underpin vibrant economies and also the social well-being health communities. Clean cooking in particular remains a glaring concern, with over 1 billion individuals in Asia Pacific exposed to health hazards of traditional cooking fuels and methods. So moreover, rural and indigenous communities face unique challenges. Not only do they grapple with limited access to modern energy services, but they are also disproportionately impacted by increased extraction activities associated with the energy transition. So it is imperative that their needs are prioritized to ensure their inclusion in sustainable energy strategies. We must not forget these communities reliant on fossil fuels industry. It's incumbent that they are provided with the necessary employment and rescaling opportunities to transition into the clean energy sector and other parts of the economy, ensuring that no one is left behind in the pursuit of energy transition. So finally, development partners must position themselves to provide the required support, including investment and the technologies that enables effective evidence-based decision-making and promotes cooperation among economies. Through such efforts, the shift towards sustainable energy sources can be accelerated. So finally, let us ensure that today's discussion at this webinar serve as a catalyst for action as we unite in our commitment to supporting an inclusive, sustainable, and equitable energy transition in the Asia Pacific region. Thank you very much. Back to you, Taro.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ongpeng Liu. Now we are turning to the presentation of this webinar. We'll have two presentations. First, Clovis from UN Trade and Development will make the presentation of the report, succinct summary of the report. And then Suba from ESCAP also will make a presentation after the presentation by Clovis. So now I give the floor to Clovis. Clovis, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Taro. My name is Clovis Freire. I'm the Chief of Commodity Research and Analysis Section here at the United Nations Trade and Development. I was also leading the finalization of this report, so I'm very pleased to share briefly with you the key messages of the report. So let me just share my screen. I hope you can see that. So let me start with one fact that is actually alarming. 60 years ago, when UNCTAD, the United Nations Trade and Development, was created, it was created exactly to help countries to better integrate themselves into the global economy, because most developing countries were basically exporting primary products. And this situation has not changed in these 60 years. So to give an idea, this slide shows the countries that are commodity dependent. So in UNCTAD classification, we consider commodity dependence those countries that over 60% of the exports are on commodities, either agriculture, minerals, or energy. And you see here that many of the developing regions are on that situation. In fact, 95 countries in the world are considered commodity dependent developing countries out of 195 of the ones that are members of the United Nations. The Asia Pacific region is quite particular. You see that many countries there are not dependent on commodities when you use that metric like exports or a share of exports, but in fact many countries of the region have a large share of their population is still dependent on agriculture, for example, and employed on agriculture, and the structural transformation is still a big issue and remains a priority for the region as well. And as was mentioned, what is the problem with being commodity dependent? Well, one main problem is that you depend most of your exports and revenues and budget for the government of a price of a product that you are a price taker. You don't have any influence on that price, and that you're really suffering the vagaries and volatility of the price of that. And this slide shows how the GDP per capita of developing countries, excluding China, very much matches the change in the commodity price index. The index that we have here in UNCTAD that we produce with the price of different commodities. And you see that very much one follows the other. So how to get out of commodity dependence? Diversification is the ultimate way to do that. So diversify the economy, diversify the number of exports. We know that the total output of the economy, the total GDP, is associated with the diversification of exports. You see in this graph here, each one of these dots is a different country, and you see how the GDP, total GDP of the country very much matches the number of products that the country exports. So if the diversification is the way out, it's not easy to do. Countries are trying to do that for many years. What we should have take in consideration when going through this process, and this is the first message of this report, is that when going through this process of diversification, that is critical, that is necessary, is important also to take in consideration the inclusiveness aspects of this process. Because in many times what happens is that through the process of economic diversification, there are inequalities within countries that are emphasized. So although diversification reduces the gap between countries, the gaps within countries can be increased. And we have done an analysis in the report, and we show these numbers there. We have over 182 countries over the last 20 years, and we see that unfortunately what's happened is that the economic diversification has been associated with this increase in inequality. The second message of the report is that now the countries, developing countries and commodity-dependent developing countries, they have to diversify their economy, going through a process, a path that is totally different from what other countries have done in the past when they were in their process of development when they were going through diversification. Why they have to be different? Because they have now to diversify through a low carbon path. And what is difficult to do that, because as you see in this graph we show two sets of countries. In blue is the commodity dependent developing countries, and in green the countries that are not commodity dependent. And what we have there is the average diversification of these countries associated with average emissions of these countries. And what we see in the graph is that commodity dependent countries and countries that are not dependent on commodities, they follow the same path. Every new product that they add to their exports adds carbon emissions in the atmosphere. Actually, we have looking from data from 1995 to 2019, we found that every new product that they diversify in the economy, you add 3.1 tons of carbon emissions in the atmosphere. So countries now have to not only diversify, but do it in a cleaner way, which is a much higher bar to go over. And we know that another thing to take in consideration is that these commodity dependent developing countries, they by themselves, they don't emit much emissions per capita. So this graph shows in the difference of CDDCs, are commodity dependent developing countries, and you see that the emissions per capita, both of the CO2 emissions and also greenhouse gas emissions, are much lower than other groups of countries and countries. For example, the average commodity dependent developing country, it emits just a third of what an European country would emit. And Russia would emit 6 times more than that, and the US 7 times more than an average commodity dependent developing country. So how to go through this process of diversification and development in a low carbon way? We can look at the experience of the countries that were the first countries to industrialize. And here we have some of them: France, UK, US, Japan. And you see that what this graph shows is the output elasticity. It's basically saying how much more of CO2 emissions you put in the atmosphere for every dollar in your GDP. And if this number is lower than 1, it means that you are decoupling your emissions to your economic growth. So you see that countries have been reducing this association between every dollar that they produce in terms of GDP and emissions. But you see that they do at different rates, at different paths. And you see that took a long time for these first industrialized countries to really start to decouple. So what that can teach us and teach developing countries in terms of their process of diversification through a low path, of low carbon path. It shows that countries will have different timings to do that. Some countries will go faster, some countries will take some more time, and that the international community and the development partners should help these countries in this process, understanding the difference between the pace of evolution of each one of them. And how to go through this process? In the report, we go deeper on green industrial policies for these commodity dependent developing countries. And those are industrial policies that have as the direction, so they are sectoral policies, they deal with specific sectors, but they also have the direction to move towards sustainability and greener paths for the development of the countries. And we identified some entry points for commodity dependent countries that are dependent on different commodities. For example, countries that are dependent on agriculture, they can promote this diversification through the value chain by adding value, but also local processing, and also adopting digital and climate friendly agricultural techniques to improve their production, improve the trade, and also help to diversify the economy. For fossil fuel dependent countries, it's very important for them to really convert these rich the assets of hydrocarbon into other forms of capital that are more sustainable. So invest in that in other diversification through other value chains, using sovereign wealth funds to do that. And this could be a way for these fuel dependent countries that will suffer very much through this process as well, because of the potential of these stranded resources, right? They do have resources that the demand for that, the carbon based fuels will expected to reduce in the future, so they will have to transition. And for mineral dependent countries, now we have an opportunity for these countries with the increasing demand for critical energy transition minerals, these minerals that are important for the technologies for the energy transition, like solar panel, for the batteries of EV vehicles, and so on. And these countries can use now this increase for the demand for these critical minerals to support their value addition domestically, support downstream diversification in the critical minerals supply chain, and with that promote the structural transformation of the economies. So doing that also taking consideration environmental, social, and government and governance standards is critical. The role of international support. Well, it's important for the international community to help to stabilize commodity markets. Commodity price volatility remains a big challenge and is one of the key problems that the commodity dependent countries face. Also combat tax evasion, illicit financial flows, that's very common in certain areas and commodity value chains. Promote technology transfer, build the capacity building, technological capacity building, facilitate the use of some of trade and investment measures that would allow the build of the capacity of the domestic sector, domestic companies to help them to integrate on these value chains and through global value chains as well. Support the energy transition and also provide adequate financial support for that process. And we'll be hearing a presentation just right now on that part related to finance. So with that, I finalize the presentation. The report is available in the UN Trade and Development UNCTAD website, and I invite you all to download the report and take a look, and look forward for the discussions with the panel. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you, Clovis, for this excellent presentation. Now, I give the floor to Suba for another presentation on financing transition towards clean energy. Suba, you have the floor, please.
Thanks, Taro. And I'm just trying to share my screen. So just let me know if you can see it. Just let me know if you can see and if everything is okay.
Yes, it's okay. I can see it.
Okay, perfect.
I don't know
Great.
whether yeah.
I'll assume everyone can see it. So a big thank you and a congratulations to Miho, Clovis, and Taro for the launch of the report on inclusive diversification and energy transition, and a big congratulations, and also thank you for inviting ESCAP just to speak today on financing. So just to introduce myself from ESCAP, my name is Suba. I'm the Chief of Section for Financing for Development. And I think pertinent to many of the issues that Clovis was just talking about around financial support, but also around transitioning away from fossil fuels and therefore who pays for that. There's a brief presentation we have that maybe raises some questions as well as maybe some solutions on financing. So this is already well known, but maybe just to say clearly that in 2020, the Asia Pacific region released, a huge amount of CO2 emissions, but it was the highest ever global share of energy emissions, 60%. Coal is 63% of the region's emissions. And as Hong Peng was also saying, in addition to the pledge on tripling renewable energy capacity that was made at COP, the share of renewable energy in the power system in Southeast Asia alone will need to rise from 2% to 18%, which is actually almost ninefold, far beyond the tripling that has been discussed. A little bit of a sense of the financing gap. So the total financing and investment needs to achieve climate, nature, and SDG goals per year by 2030 in emerging markets and developing economies, excluding China. So this includes the EMDs across Asia as well as globally, is 5.4 trillion. So 5.4 trillion is needed per year to meet climate goals, nature goals, and SDG goals. The energy transition, it's estimated, and this comes from the G20, roughly estimated about 1.6 trillion a year, which obviously is both from public and private sources. The lack of adequate financial resources is one of the main challenges facing Asia-Pacific countries, which, as Hong Peng mentioned, is slightly behind the rest of the world in terms of renewable energy installation or transition. For us at ESCAP, financing strategies that meet these goals are increasingly being requested, the triple agenda. And what we're starting to see is that a very specific mix of domestic, international, public, and private financial resources are required for each country. So each country will have its own financing pathway, but increasingly private finance is required to play a larger and larger role. Yet, if we look at the quick macro perspective, and this is from our survey which was just launched a few weeks ago, we see that in the region, real GDP growth isn't at what it was, but is still much higher than most of the world. And we see inflation has come down significantly, but is still very high. And this affects the cost of financing, which is why we're speaking about it. If we look at the interest rate on debt commitments, how much it costs to finance, let's say, renewable energy or to finance stranded assets, the average interest is rising. At the same time, yields where investors might be making money is slightly declining or still quite high in the developing Asia Pacific. So if we ask countries, sovereign states, to issue sovereign bonds in their own, even if it's in their own currency, to finance, let's say, the infrastructure that it's required around transitioning away from fossil fuels into renewable energy, let's say grid upgrades, etc., the cost of financing for that is still extremely high. And finally, the maturity on those debt commitments is actually starting to become lower. So typically, renewable energy or stranded asset financing is, I think, 20 to 30-year financing is required. But for most countries, they are looking at maybe 10 years. If you're an LDC, you're looking at a 5-year loan that you're able to issue. Interest rates are high, and the average interest, whether it's for private or official, is still very high, and you're in a slow growth inflationary environment. We know that financing the energy transition in Asia Pacific also brings added co-benefits, which have value in terms of GDP. So I won't talk about the air quality or other things, but if you look at the bottom right, we know that financing the energy transition actually has a multiplier effect on growth. So the IMF, for example, estimates that there's a 1.1 to 1.5 multiplier associated with spending on renewables, which is larger than the multiplier of spending on fossil fuel energy investment, which is 0.6. So you will get more growth if you are actually able to finance renewable energy. For us, as we are looking at that transition, obviously, there needs to be an explicit effort to include the just aspects. For the financial system, an orderly planned transition is absolutely essential for banks and central banks and capital markets, because the danger is that governments institute policy around the energy transition, for example, saying that by 2030, all our, I mean, this is an exaggerated example, no banks are allowed to finance coal anymore. If that kind of regulation is instituted quickly without warning, it becomes a disorderly transition, and financial portfolios run the risk of becoming extremely, obviously, depreciated, devalued, capital flows outside. So for regulators, a orderly planned transition is critical. There's also a recognition that developing countries face a much higher burden of capital investment for this transition. than developed countries, which again requires specific long-term cheap financing. And financing solutions that actually creates the co-benefits around air or water. That means that finance has to be structured in a particular way. It means that it has to be distributed in a particular way. It means that the clauses and the covenants and the financing for both private and public purposes need to be staggered and sequenced in a particular way, and it needs to have political buy-in as well. So I'll just stop here after this is my final slide. Our analysis shows that both the volume, obviously the size, but the composition of financing for the energy transition needs to change in the region. We need to double the financing of energy in the region. We need to shift the sectoral composition of such financing. We need to shift the geographical destinations of such financing because most of this has been concentrated in a few markets. And concessional financing also very much needs to increase, which is a separate topic on its own. So I'll stop there for now, but I look forward to the discussion with the panelists.
Thank you, Suba, for giving us a precise idea, the financing gap. Now we are moving to the panel discussion. And before I introduce our eminent panelists, I know there are some people who already put their questions in the Q&A box. And for those who don't know, please kindly write your question in the Q&A box. And later on during the discussions, I'll read them out for the panelists so that they can respond to your questions. And now I would like to introduce the panelists. I'll start by Rashmi. In English, they say ladies first, so I'll start by Rashmi. Rashmi is a researcher at the Transnational Institute in Jakarta, Indonesia. She's a lawyer and she has a background in international trade law and a master from the School of Law at the University of Indonesia. She has been involved in several just trade policy advocacy and campaigns since 2011 with a focus on intellectual property rights on seed and medicines, investment treaties and corporate lawsuits, and digital trade, including trade-related impact on energy and raw materials. Welcome, Rashmi, to this panel. And then we have Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim is an associate research fellow at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, where he's analyzing the potential economy and industrial policies of Asia developing countries. He holds a PhD in Development Studies, Policy Economic from the King's College London, and his thesis focused on the role of state-owned entities in economic development. Prior to his PhD, he received a master's degree from the London School of Economics and work at the Samsung Economic Research Institute, covering the Association of Southeast Asia nations and the European Union for 6 years. His recent publications include journal article in Structural Change, Economic Dynamics, Competition and Change, Journal of Contemporary Asia, and the Pacific Review. And last but not least, Mr. Xiaolong is a Deputy Director of Research at Khazanah Research Institute in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He focuses on industrial policy, climate change, and future technology. He spent a decade working in the federal and the state government and another decade in civil society and academia. Xiaolong holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry and a Master's of Science in Environmental Technology from Imperial College, London, and a Master of Art in Cultural Studies from the Goldsmith College in London. So, welcome to all of you panelists. And we would like to make this panel discussion as interactive as possible. Therefore, I invite you to give very short responses to our questions so that people can ask many questions. And as I told you, there are already some questions in the Q&A box, so I'll start by that. I see a question from Isa Tushar, and she say, how do regional dynamics and college challenges influence the approach of inclusive economic diversification and energy transitions in Asia Pacific countries, and how does the collaboration address these complexities? The floor is to who would like to take it to respond to the question. All right, I read it again. If I start to ask, how do regional dynamics and challenges influence the approach to inclusive economic diversification and energy transition in Asia Pacific countries? And how does the collaboration address these complexities?
Perhaps I can start a little bit with
Sure, Clovis.
reflect on that. It's a very interesting question. And I really would like to hear my colleagues independent to reflect on that as well. Well, what are the regional dynamics in the region? We know that the region is a powerhouse in terms of manufacturing in many countries, but it's also very is heterogeneous in the development trajectory of different countries. So it's a very heterogeneous region there. So also a lot of integration in the region. So there are opportunities for diversification through inserting themselves, countries inserting themselves in different value chains. Not necessarily easy to move up on those value chains. So I think that also some countries more already progressing, like we see China continue moving in terms of technological development and diversify as well its economy. So some of the production moving to other countries and being facilitated by this regional integration. So for sure, that influenced the way that countries have been trying to diversify their economies in the region. I would say particularly the being very close by to China, Japan, Korea, and being integrated, potentially being integrated on those value chains. What happened is that sometimes they are so successful in that they become very successful in being producing in the lower part of on these value chains, not being able to move up, and that is where perhaps the collaboration should be focused on helping to build the technological capabilities, innovation capabilities that are required to move up on those value chains in the region. But again, a lot of different countries at different stages. We have many countries in the region that are least developed countries that still facing the challenge of the structural transformation. So it's very difficult to give a single answer for a region that is so diverse. It's really important to look at different groups of countries and countries in particular to move that. But so initial reflections, perhaps here.
I have a similar question also prepared. I don't know whether somebody else would like to react, but I have Suba. I can see that you want to talk, right?
Yeah, maybe just to sort of add to what Clovis has already said. I mean, you know, obviously the team is much more experienced in the diversification part, but in terms of the regional dynamics, I mean, I think it's important to realize that Asia Pacific contributes over 70% to global growth. That growth is powered by cheap, secure energy, cheap, secure, and reliable energy. And and that has implications in the transition, because if the transition is towards energy sources that are a little bit more expensive or not as reliable, or not as, you cannot store as much energy, particularly for certain industry, that has an implication on growth, and it has an implication on votes. And I think certain governments and certain countries in the region are very aware of the costs of that transition. And then final point is to realize that in any transition, especially in the energy transition, there are winners and losers. And this is a very contested transition, especially in this region. That's also why you see it being slow to sign up on the financial side to net zero commitments, because most of the financial institutions are financing, fossil fuels and fossil fuel related activities. It is definitely a challenge.
Thank you for adding to the response by Clovis. Now I have related questions. I have a related question to Kim. Kim, given the unique economic and environmental challenges faced by the Asia and the Pacific region, what tailored strategies can be employed to achieve inclusive economic diversification and low carbon transition? The floor is yours.
Thank
Kim.
you very much for the presentation and for asking me an important question. So, as the Commodities and Development report suggests, diversification strategies must be customized to fit the unique circumstances of each country. And while the nature of diversification policies might be diverse, obviously, it's essential to include some of the key common characteristics that have underpinned past successful industrial policies. So industrial policies need to focus on new specific activities rather than supporting old entrenched activities. And the benchmarks for success and failure should be measurable and predefined. Additionally, policies should often have a sunset or phase out clause, which will help the government to let losers leave after a certain period. Moreover, policies can benefit the community by setting carefully designed conditionalities such as value addition, employment and export, and perhaps most importantly, they need to be strictly and fairly applied. Furthermore, industrial policies need to be implemented by competent and transparent government institutions that have an arm's length relationship with potential beneficiaries. These characteristics are important not only to improve the effectiveness of diversification policies, but also for the government to gain political legitimacy and sustain the implementation of industrial policies with the public support. And industrial policy design is frequently influenced by political factors, yet there are important technical aspects that the international community can help developing countries in improving.
Thank you, Kim. Is there anyone who would like to add something to what Kim has said, or?
Perhaps I would like to make a
sure.
comment that is very important. Thank you very much, Kim. What you mentioned in terms of the policies promoting new products and not in entrenched sectors it's a very important element, and difficult to identify new sectors. They are not the political economy. You also mentioned that, and I think that is a big challenge because you don't have the stakeholders to promote the new industries, right? But now with the energy transition, that is an opportunity for it, because the energy transition can give the direction for this movement of diversification. And we do have champions of the energy transition. So the energy transition could give this direction for new sectors, for diversifying the economies towards new products, and you have this political economy of the push for the transition. So yeah, thank you. I think it's very relevant, that point.
Thank you, Clovis. I saw that Shalom has raised his hand, but then lowered it. I don't know whether you still want to speak or not.
Sure. Thanks, Taro. I thought I could either make a point later or now. I think in addition to the industrial policies with energy transition, most countries will have some form of fuel subsidy in place, right? And then it's politically sensitive, of course. but it's a very important welfare instrument for cushioning lower income households. And when one is engaging in transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies, shifting the support structure of government spending, as well as the incentive structure and welfare structure, it becomes a very tricky process of sequencing of the appropriate form of policy tools, levels of intervention. I say this to say the Malaysian experience, we're still struggling with it. And we're taking a very gradualist approach, where, say, for example, in terms of fuel at the petrol pump, we're currently maintaining subsidies on regular petrol, but we are aiming to remove subsidies on diesel as a first cut. Electricity subsidies have been also scaled back for higher income, higher consumption households, but they're being maintained for lower consumption households. And of course, there's some cross subsidy that goes towards renewable energy as well. It's very complex, and one has to do a lot of engagement to get buy-in from different stakeholders in order for policy to change. Of course, the further you are down the line, especially if you're, say, a fossil fuel exporting country like, say, Malaysia is, then those kind of systems can be quite entrenched. And then in a way, you maybe also be juggling multiple priorities, maybe juggling considerations of whether you want to impose a value-added tax, for example, which is a consumption tax. But then if you scale back fossil fuel subsidies, that becomes a de facto downward pressure on consumption as well. So you may have to consider whether you separate out these kinds of reforms or whether you bunch them together, and whether your political legitimacy can survive that sort of combined transition pressure as well. So I think it is important to do forms of studies and forecasting on this, and then for the government to have a menu of options as well.
Many thanks, Shalong, for your extensive response to the question. Now I turn to Rashmi. I got a question for you. What inclusive policies can be implemented to ensure that the economic benefit of diversification and energy transition are equitably distributed across different societal groups? Rashmi, you have the floor, please.
Thanks, Mr. Taro. Yeah, I think I just want to start here before I respond the questions. So I would like to start my statements that today that we are still experiencing global development inequality. And as Mr. Clovis' presentations, it is clear how the international support is really important to addressing or even to realizing the agenda, the development agenda of the diversifications and energy transitions. Because I would like to emphasize, as we know that the deepening of the global economic crisis, as we know, not only because of the US-China trade war or the pandemic of COVID-19, it is really clear that it has resulted a vulnerability or a deep vulnerability of developing countries' dependency, as in the presentations by Mr. Clovis. But in the same time, we are also facing, facing injustice in the context of the international setting standard. Because, for example, like Indonesia, after the COVID-19 itself, the government tried to use these situations as an important turning point, right, for our countries to revisit the economic diversification strategy and push a big leap for its implementations. Like, as you heard that now we have the expansions of nickel processing industries for EV batteries, or even under the current of comprehensive investment and policy plan of JEPIS, now we are trying to broadening our mineral processing industry to support the productions of solar panel, for example. But we are facing difficulties where it comes to the big issues on policy spaces. Because if Indonesia want to create more jobs in responding to demographic bonuses and the potential risk of the middle income trap right now, of course, industrializations, we cannot avoid industrialization's agenda in developing countries with specializations and new roles on global value chains activities are necessary. But we need the support from the trade investment policies arena, because these agreements play central roles. Yeah, I know that most of you agreed that this agenda quite important, how we can discuss a new model or a new approach of a global trade agenda right now that can really support the development agenda for the global country, for the developing countries, especially for the least developed countries. And we know that the current debates, for example, at the WTO, it can deepening the crisis that are facing by the developing countries, because we can still see an inclusive and development-oriented outcome for developing countries on the global trade agenda is still hard to achieve. I know that some of you attended in the MC13 meeting on March, but I guess there are a lot of development agenda for developing countries still becomes a big homework for our in realizing the diversifications and the for energy transition itself. For example, we can still hear how the long-awaited outstanding development issues under the Doha Development Agenda should be abandoned, still abandoned by the North countries, for example, because we still need to ensure that how these multilateral institutions can ensure the strengthening the special differential treatment provisions for developing countries, for example, or to ensure the transfer technology agenda under the TRIPS agreement, where I think the WTO could support these mechanisms and frameworks, because this is the essential elements if the developing countries would like to take next steps for their industrializations to promote the climate change mitigations, decarbonizations, or green industrialization technologies, even for digitalizations. And of course, the important elements on this context actually local content requirements. We know that now the North countries or industrialized developed countries are trying to push new rules, especially under the plurilateral agreements. We know that they are trying to push more liberalized for environmental goods and services. But once again, eliminating tariffs on environmental goods and services will only allow most developing countries almost completely dependent on imports. So I guess the context of local content requirements is still become an effective policy instrument to create a viable domestic industry. So we can have more local products to fulfill the diversification agenda right now. So please, we still need to ensure how the local content requirements can implemented by the developing country. But I think what Indonesia's government has done so far with local content requirements, for example, for EV battery productions, it should be implemented consistently so we can build more mature production value chains in the country. But if we see the JETP documents on comprehensive investment and policy plans released by the JETP Secretariat itself, it noted that how for the IFIs, for example, they should ensure that the local content requirements should be put as an exceptions. So I think this is like a contradictions, right? If we want to ensure the diversifications of economy, but on the other side, when we receive money that from the international financial institutions that would like to support the infrastructure development on energy transitions, they still think that local content requirement is not a good policies for developing countries like in Indonesia to build our own industrializations. And the last thing that I also want to emphasize, because you mentioned about the regional, but if we see the crisis at the WTO as a multilateral institutions, we cannot also legitimate the developed industrialized countries to insist developing countries to adopt WTO plus standard and unilateral actions imposed by the developed countries that once again undermine our state sovereignty. For example, as we know that Indonesia now is negotiating the FTA with EU, where once again we see that several provisions, especially the chapter on energy and raw materials chapters, that will regulate the opening of market access and investment in the energy and raw material sectors, especially where the EU want to ask Indonesian government to not implement the export ban for raw materials, including they would like to prohibit monopolistic measures and government interventions in the pricing of energy goods and raw materials. And this is a provisions that once again, like I said, will undermine the industrialization agenda mandated under the constitutions of Indonesia. So I think how we can address the current debates at the WTO, the crisis at the WTO, and will give a clear outcome, a support outcome for developing countries to realizing their own industrial policies agenda. That should be one of the priority agenda for the WTO or even in the other international fora debates. I think that's my response, Mr. Taro.
Thank you very much for a comprehensive response. Now I turn to Suba. You mentioned in your presentation the gap in financing. Now, how can the regional collaboration within the ESCAP framework be enhanced to support member countries in financing their diversification efforts and transition to sustainable energy, particularly through shared technology, investment, and knowledge? Suba, you have the floor, please.
Thanks, Taro. Yeah, I mean, I think responding a little bit to what I think Rashmi also has said, in our region, we have two JETPs. We have the Indonesia JETP, we have the Vietnam JETP, and there's only two other JETPs in South Africa and Senegal. So in terms of thinking about a mix of financing, so we've got donors in there, very little grant money, mostly commercial money, international financial institutions. We've got policy commitments to do the energy transition. And we've got a list of regulatory commitments by Indonesia and Vietnam as well in order to build an environment for a just energy transition. So what we're seeing at ESCAP is that many countries are coming to us asking to learn from Indonesia and Vietnam. For example, one member state has requested collaboration specifically on setting up a carbon credit trading scheme that will specifically trade the carbon credits from the coal phase out as part of the JETP and try and use that revenue to compensate coal owners for that phase out of the stranded asset. So we think that there's a tremendous amount of learning, obviously very context specific. I think as Rashmi also mentioned, there are particular interest by all of our member states to hold on to certain financing requirements, certain local content, and they don't always match with international requirements. So how do we bring in more financing or donor commitment within an overall framework? I mean, the JETPs are only one example, and there's obviously lots of successes, but also challenges there. But we at ESCAP are also thinking how we can bring together the region around new financing partnerships. And whether that's located within one country or located across countries, it's still a question to think about. ASEAN obviously has a framework around sustainable finance taxonomies and trying to transition finance taxonomy as well. Those are approaches we are looking at to replicate across sub-regions. I guess that's not a very conclusive answer, but just to also conclude that the Asia Pacific region is not a uniform region. It isn't, and especially when it comes to the energy transition, certain countries are very advanced in the energy transition. Certain countries are figuring their way out with the assistance of other capital, and there isn't enough money to go around right now for the energy transition as well. So it is a mix of approaches we're seeing that I can point to.
Thank you very much, Suba. Now we have an open question, but a very precise one. And the question goes like this: what are the most promising renewable energy technologies for achieving a low carbon future? And what are the respective challenges and limitations? Because I think during the presentations and the opening remark, we talk a lot about solar, wind, and all those things. So for the region specifically, for the Asia and Pacific region, what are the most promising renewable energy technologies? The question is to whoever wants to respond to it. Xiaolong, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll take this one. I think it's an interesting one. Unfortunately, there's no one answer that covers the whole region because every country has to look at their national circumstances, and they may find that different technologies may also have different levels of applicability within the country. I mean, I'll give you an example. Wind, right? Within, say, Southeast Asia, Vietnam apparently has huge wind potential, as is the Philippines. But countries like, say, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, and I would say most of Indonesia, there's almost no wind potential. Within Malaysia, where the wind potential exists is just in the sort of extreme east and northeast. Of course, there is offshore wind potential, but then offshore wind is very, very, very expensive. So one of the exercises that we found useful at the national level was that I think in 2023, our energy ministry commissioned a study from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. So that at least gave a scenario of what 100% RE transition would look like. That, of course, came with quite a high transition cost. It was something like about 2.1, I think, trillion ringgit, or about 415 billion US dollars. But that's also because it included offshore wind for the final push. Eventually, the government decided to go for a cheaper scenario of about maybe 66% of that cost. And it was also able to do so largely because Malaysia has a lot of sinks, right? I think it's also important to remember when we're comparing technologies and approaches coming from developed countries about energy transition, they've largely deforested their countries. The US, for example, the sinks only cover about 11% of their emissions. The Malaysian example I'm most familiar with, our sinks currently cover about 65% of our emissions. So our transition scenario is very, very different. And we intend to use gas, for example, in our net zero scenario. Not every country is going to have that option. But some countries, especially if you do have wind, is incredibly cheap. But of course, once you go offshore, then it becomes much, much more expensive. And it's not just the question of the cost of the technology. I think one of the problems that we're running into in the energy transition conversation, besides the cost of capital that Suba brought up, is also the rate of profit. Unfortunately, fossil fuels remain quite profitable, right? We're talking about 15 or so % rate of return, but renewables are looking at a rate of return of about 5 to 8%. When you've got that kind of differential existing, then it can be very hard to move capital from fossil fuel investment to renewables. So then the policy challenge becomes, how do you make renewable energy sufficiently profitable? Because the issue of the cheapness of renewable energies has largely been solved, right? Solar is very cheap, wind is very cheap, but the problem is that you can't move capital into it because it's not sufficiently profitable. So that's when policies like feed-in tariffs come into play. I think one of the tough lessons that we learned about having a feed-in tariff was that it was phased out too soon in Malaysia. It proved too profitable for users and maybe a bit too painful for the utility company. I think in Vietnam also they learned that feed-in tariff was really good at drawing in investment, but whether they were able to sort of follow through with that has proved a challenge as well. So reconciling these things of ensuring renewable transition is profitable and also financially sustainable, I think remains a challenge. I think there's a lot to be learned, lessons to be shared. I think we do have to take a bespoke approach. Going back to what Suba said about sustainable taxonomies, I think there's also a trend of sustainability taxonomies being imported from Europe. And so we're looking at European priorities. Europe, for example, considers gas to be amber. So it's sort of okay for investment, but then coal is red. And even in the case of, say, a country that's, say, at already net zero, and there are few LDCs which are at that level within the Asia Pacific, coal will be considered red for them, right? Even if they would be net negative effectively. So I think we have to ask about what is the fairness of these kind of transitions, because a lot of this, the conversation about energy transition is also happening out of the context and the framework of the Climate Change Convention, particularly the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. You don't see instruments like, say, the JETP really functioning within that framework. And JETP has a very strong geopolitical dimension. It only seems open to some countries when the offer has come from a particular group of developed countries as well. It doesn't appear open to all developing countries. So I think those kind of considerations have to be borne in mind too.
Thank you, Xiaolong. And I think this question is for Suba. The question is from our audience. They say, you have shown that the private investment is decreasing towards the financing of renewable energy transition. What are the remedies that you plan to implement or to apply?
Thanks, Taro, and maybe I'll combine that with building on what Xiaolong also just said. So actually, just to clarify, what we were showing is that private finance is required to increase almost, somewhere between 5 to 10 times in the region to meet this gap. So it's not decreasing, rather it is actually increasing. I think it's doubled in Southeast Asia over the last, I think, 5 years, but it needs to increase much more. So that's what we're saying, or what we were saying. So how do we do that? I think, and we're increasingly coming to the fact that the question of profit must be understood, right? So I think, as Xiaolong mentioned, it is true that investing in, unregulated areas or brown areas in certain contexts can be still much more profitable than investing in renewable energy. It depends obviously on credit ratings and so on and so forth. But financial regulators have a role to play in ensuring that there's a level playing field when it comes to how profit, how risk, and how return is measured and is obtained. So to give you a rough example, if a financial regulator were to say that no bank could finance coal after 2030, then every single client that borrows from any bank in that country would no longer be able to finance coal. It's a mandatory regulation. Obviously, there are challenges with a blanket mandatory regulation, but in Asia Pacific, a lot of the approaches, sustainable finance taxonomies that classify whether something is green or amber or brown, and I would say now there's, with transition finance taxonomies, responding a little bit to what Xiaolong was also saying, there is increasing recognition that transition finance taxonomies can allow you to finance brown activities that are going to green, so long as there's a credible transition path in place. The point is that a lot of the finance taxonomies, etc., are still voluntary across most of the region. They are in no way mandatory. So there has to be a discussion of how financial regulators can adjust how people make profit or private companies make profit in certain areas over time in an orderly and planned manner. Otherwise, and in a way which doesn't allow capital to be arbitraged across less regulated economies. So without that regional approach, or without even a global approach in that way, you're still going to see certain countries, it's much more profitable to invest in certain activities, and certain countries vice versa. And you will have an uneven and unequal transition that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Suba. Thank you very much for your answer. Now, I think this question is for Rashmi. What role do developing countries, particularly in the Asia and Pacific region, play in driving inclusive economic diversification and facilitating the transition to sustainable energy systems? The floor is yours, Rashmi.
Yeah, well, I think it is really clear, yeah. Like I said earlier in my statements, because of the, well, I can say that the prolongs of crisis and the, I can say the deepening of geopolitical tensions is finally, in the end, put the global south or the developing countries are caught between the web of this context, yeah, to defend their national interests. And there is no other way how the developing countries should defend the agenda, their agenda, development agenda in the context of industrializations of their economics. But I would like to also remind you how this diversification of economy and also the low carbon economic development agenda also create, well, I can say potential deepening of social problems in the society. For example, I have to refer again the experience in Indonesia, because while our government has done much to protect its own national interests by regulating the activities of to protect the local industry, but the country itself has much to do to ensure that the transition minerals for a low carbon economy doesn't turn into the resource curse. I think we need to ensure that. And there is also a remain important questions about the democratic process, right? Because the questions of equity and fairness in labor practices, the protections of the local environment, and the balance between the needs of business and those of the local populations. For example, in order to attract foreign investment to support the industrial policies, our government passed a controversial national regulation called Omnibus Law for on job creations that facilitates access to business licenses for foreign investors, including permits to access natural resources and to lease land. But on the other side, the government potentially lowering the standards, the protections of labor and environmental. So what we need today in the context of developing country to design their diversifications economic into low carbon economic development agenda, what we need today is just energy transitions that must go beyond simply shifting from fossil fuels to renewable and green energy sources. We need a fundamental conceptions of a just transitions that must be constructed through democracy towards a system of productions and reproductions focused on human well-being and ecosystem regenerations. And I think it requires governments in developing countries to be well equipped and held accountable to implement policies in the public interest. And in this context, for example, one of the issues on the ISDS or investor state dispute settlement mechanisms, we can still see how this mechanism that included in many free trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties, including the Energy Charter Treaty, has put state as hostages to the investors' interests. The mechanism itself gives corporate impunity, in which the states lack political bargaining to regulate the corporations and protect the people's rights and environment. And moreover, the regulatory chill itself prevents the state from protecting the people and narrow the people's struggle against the negative impacts of the development itself. And we see that how UNCTAD also has raised alarms, right, over the increase of ISDS lawsuits. And I think one important element also that developing countries should remind that there is a need for us to prevent the state from ratifying more international instruments and ask them to stop all agreements that govern the ISDS mechanisms. And this is also really important because while the privilege extending to the corporate sector through ISDS are legally binding, but on the other side, all existing international instruments on business and human rights are voluntary schemes. So we need an international legally binding instrument to hold multinational corporations, as also the major actor of this kind of economic development, accountable for their human rights and environmental violations. And this is also connect with the next point that I also want to mention about democracy. We need a true democracy politically and economically, because it requires a truly democratic state and decision-making process with true public participations at all levels, yeah, especially on the role of the state in providing strong national mechanisms and regulations that protecting the vulnerable people, and creating a strong enforcement law to hold corporations accountable for their business. And also another element of democracy is how to democratize the energy transitions for the people and a sustainable planet. I think that's the important element, right? Because what we want to do right now is, if we want to maintain public access to affordable energy, for example, we need the state to facilitate through subsidies and monopolies, but also how to coordinate the process of bringing back the energy productions, transmissions, and distribution infrastructure into democratic public ownerships and not to the hands of only some private companies that finally they can monopolize the whole system of energy in the world. I think that's my point, Mr. Pao.
Thank you very much, Rashmi. I see that Kim would like to react, right?
Also contribute to answering that question. So, of course, developing countries play a central role in facilitating energy transition, since they produce much of commodities necessary for the process. But for this process to be inclusive and sustainable, I would like to emphasize the importance of data availability in formulating diversification strategies within the commodities sector. So studies on commodity value chain upgrading inevitably focus on easily measurable factors such as industrial production, exports, and investment. But this narrow scope of analysis fails to provide a comprehensive understanding of the overall picture. So data on employment, taxes, profit distribution, and capital outflows through dividend payout are often not readily accessible. Furthermore, information concerning the influence wielded by raw commodity sellers and buyers, often refineries, and the extent of government intervention in shaping this power dynamic is frequently shrouded in secrecy. So such data and information are crucial for assessing the overall impact and identifying means to mitigate the adverse effect of diversification strategies on affected parties. So I think that the global community and donors play a pivotal role in supporting the government of developing countries in enhancing the collection and dissemination of such data and information, vital for formulating tailored diversification strategies that are inclusive and sustainable.
Thank you, Kim. I don't know whether Clovis would like to react or.
Yes, I just want to react to what Suba and Kim said. Yes, is indeed, no, Suba, sorry, Rashmi. And it's one thing that I would like to react is to say that I like when you said that we should expand what we think about energy transition and these transitions. The energy transition cannot be the sole goal if I always like to use this thought experiment, imagining that tomorrow we solve the energy transition issue. We solve that. We have all our cars, electric vehicles. If you plug your computer in the outlet, you be sure that you're receiving energy through a renewable source. Everything is as we would like to have in the energy transition part of it. But everything else remains the same. You know, we remain with the countries dependent on commodities as they are, 95 of them. The countries without the structural transformation, all those issues remain. Clearly, that is not the solution. So it cannot be pursued as a sole goal. The energy transition has to be as part of sustainable development, but other things are involved on that as well. So I believe what Rashmi was really arguing is for us to not forget these other things, and then that what is important. And Kim was mentioning that is exactly, that is a very and others have mentioned as well, it's not a uniform process. It's very dependent on particular situation of countries, sectors, on how to move on that. You need data to understand how this process is to go, and data that many times we don't have yet, and there's possibilities as we are looking for possible paths of diversification that are inclusive, that are sustainable, but at the end of the day, that really push the structural transformation of this country. So it's requires quite a lot of information, and the international community has a role to play on that aspect.
Thank you, Clovis. Thank you very much. Now I have another question, an open one. What kind of support is being given to the countries that are predominantly into agriculture and they have no capacity for major exports? Also, if we look at the effect of climate change issues, how do these activities like mining, agriculture, and energy become controlled to ensure that there is no further impact to the environment? The floor is open. Whoever wants to answer the question is welcome.
Well, I can start a little bit just to give it, we say that how can we ensure that agriculture, minerals, and energy will not impact the environment? Well, that's a daunting task, right? I believe that we are moving technologically, the policies trying to move to use of production process that are cleaner, and this is a process. It takes time, but clearly it requires technological development, innovation, and ways to move on that aspect. What countries that are dependent on agriculture can do? What I have mentioned is that these countries, they most clearly on the value chain of agriculture, there are opportunities for diversification there, particularly through local processing, food processing, but the diversification should not be restricted on that area. Should go to other areas as well beyond the agricultural value chains. And it requires a strategy that is for the economy as a whole, and to give a direction of this process. But the countries that are dependent on agriculture, they do have the possibility as well to diversify the economies, as other countries have done and are pursuing. Just a few comments. I'm not sure colleagues would like to complement.
No reaction?
So Kim?
Yeah, Kim, please go ahead.
I believe there was a question on the environmental impact of the diversification process, right? So let me use Indonesia's nickel sector upgrading strategy that Rashmi has already mentioned as an example. So while still at an early stage, I think the strategy has been fairly successful in terms of value addition and exports, but there are major concerns regarding the environment. With the increasing demand for nickel ore, illegal mining in some areas in Indonesia is also on the rise, and illegal mining conducted without the necessary forest area utilization permit is accelerating deforestation in Indonesia. And another environmental concern is related to the disposal of tailings from nickel processing. Currently, smelters aim to produce low nickel containing class 2 product through pyrometallurgy, but several new plants will aim to produce class 1 products which are used for making batteries through hydrometallurgical treatment using high pressure acid leaching, or HPAL. And one consulting firm estimates that for each ton of nickel produced using HPAL, approximately 1.4 to 1.6 tons of waste are produced. And this waste requires treatment for storage and disposal. And these processes can lead to contamination, particularly in environments like that in Indonesia. And also turning Indonesia's nickel ores into class 1 products is an energy-intensive process that generates significant greenhouse gas emissions. And this issue is a key concern considering around 90% of Indonesia's energy comes from fossil fuels. And considering these side effects, the international community, which will be consuming much of Indonesia's nickel, has an important role in supporting the Indonesian government and other developing countries in improving the environmental standards of mining diversification policies by sharing technology and innovation, as well as providing vital financing.
Thank you very much. We have many questions, but unfortunately, time is up. So I'll ask Clovis, maybe there's a last question. Would you please share the presentation? So, and then you have the last word to conclude the webinar, please.
Yeah, thank you, Taro. The presentations will be available in the website of the webinar. I would like first to thank our panelists, Kim, Rashmi, Yang Xiaolong, and Suba, and colleagues from ESCAP for participating and organizing this webinar. It was great to have you here. Let me just give a few words. I think what we could hear from the discussions and questions and answers is that as in other regions in Asia Pacific is not homogeneous, is not uniform. So there will be different paths for these countries going through this transition. This transition has to go beyond considering only the energy transition, but has to take that opportunity to through this transition that is not only the energy transition, but digital transition is very intertwined, to be an opportunity for countries to go through their structural transformations as well. That would require that to be actually profitable for investment to be done. So would require policies to direct, to help to direct capital to the paths of this transformation. The role of international community, trade and trade regimes are critical. That was highlighted as well. So how countries can be inserted in trade and use trade to foster their domestic capacities and of their domestic firms. So for them to be able to produce domestically is very important. And also without forgetting the impact on environment, social impact, so to be able to combine and with the sustainable environmental aspects of it. I think there are many areas for us to discuss. It was great to have that conversation. So we have some of these elements for the Asia Pacific region. And I thank you all very much, and thank all the participants for the questions posted in the comments. And with that, I would say that we could conclude the webinar, right, Taro? Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you very much.
Mr.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.